The ranch had always been quiet at dawn. That was the whole reason I bought it. Miles of open land, dry grass rolling into the distance, wooden fences that had been standing longer than most of the people in the nearby town, and a house that creaked in a way that felt honest rather than broken. Mornings like this were usually predictable. Coffee brewing, boots on the porch, the sun creeping up over the hills like it had all the time in the world. That morning, it didn't. The phone started vibrating before the sun was fully up. Not a gentle buzz either. The kind of vibration that makes your stomach tighten before your brain even catches up. I didn't check the time at first. I didn't need to. Nobody calls that early unless something's wrong, or unless they think they're in charge. When I picked up the phone, I could already tell this wasn't going to be a normal day. Within minutes, the calm of the ranch was gone. The quiet air felt heavier, like it knew something ugly was on the way. I stood at the window, looking out over land I legally owned, land I paid for, land that had my name on every piece of paperwork that mattered. And yet, somewhere out there, someone had decided it wasn't mine anymore. This wasn't the first time I'd had issues with the HOA that controlled the development miles down the road. Technically, my ranch wasn't even part of their association. It existed before their gates, their rules, their boards, and their obsession with control. But that never stopped them from trying. The HOA president had been a problem from the start. The type of person who treated authority like a costume instead of a responsibility. She had complained about my fencing, my livestock, the dust from my dirt road, even the fact that my land didn't match the aesthetic of her community. None of it held any legal weight, and every complaint had been dismissed. That apparently wasn't enough for her. At some point, she had convinced herself that the rules she enforced inside her little bubble applied everywhere else too. Including my ranch. Including my home. Including land she had no claim to whatsoever. The reason came out later, but the short version was simple. Her adult son wanted land. My land. The ranch, in her mind, was wasted on someone like me. She saw open space and decided it should belong to her family. And when she didn't get her way through letters, threats, and fabricated violations, she escalated in the only way she knew how. She called 911. By the time I stepped out onto the porch, I could hear sirens in the distance. Not close yet, but close enough. The sound carried differently out here. No buildings to swallow it, no traffic to drown it out. Just open land and a noise that didn't belong. I remember thinking how absurd it all was. Police being dispatched to remove me from my own property because someone else felt entitled to it. Not because of a crime. Not because of danger. But because an HOA president decided her authority extended past reality. As the vehicles got closer, dust rose along the road leading to the ranch. I didn't move. I didn't panic. I didn't start calling lawyers or scrambling for documents. Everything I needed was already in place. Deeds filed. Boundaries surveyed. Records updated. This wasn't my first rodeo with entitled people. It just happened to be the most dramatic one so far. 2 patrol cars pulled up and stopped near the gate. The sight of them alone would have been enough to scare most people. The uniforms, the lights, the official presence. That was exactly what she was counting on. Fear. Compliance. Embarrassment. I could already picture her somewhere nearby, probably watching from her car or standing just far enough away to feel powerful without being responsible. Confident. Smug. Certain she had finally won. The officers stepped out and began surveying the area. A ranch house. Fencing. Livestock. Clear. Signs of long-term ownership and operation. Nothing about the scene suggested trespassing. Nothing suggested urgency. And yet, they were there because a caller insisted I had to be removed immediately. From their perspective, they were responding to a complaint. From mine, this was an intrusion based on a lie. The situation stayed strangely calm on the surface. No shouting. No sudden movements. Just that uncomfortable tension that comes when two realities collide. One based on facts and law. The other based on entitlement and delusion. As the minutes passed, it became clear that this wasn't going to resolve quickly. The HOA president hadn't just claimed I was trespassing. She had spun a story. She claimed the land belonged to the association. She claimed her son had rights to it. She claimed I was refusing to leave and becoming aggressive. None of it was true, but lies don't need to be true to cause problems. They just need to be loud. While the officers reviewed information and tried to make sense of the situation, I stood there thinking about how easily this could have gone wrong for someone else. How many people get bullied off their own property because they don't know the law, or don't feel confident standing their ground when authority shows up. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about my ranch anymore. This was about exposing how far people like her were willing to go when they believed power was on their side. Somewhere between the dust, the paperwork, and the growing confusion, the tone of the situation began to shift. Questions were asked that didn't line up with the story they were given. Timelines didn't match. Jurisdiction started to matter. And the certainty that the HOA president had relied on began to crack. She had made one critical mistake. A mistake so basic, so avoidable, that it was almost impressive in its arrogance. She had never bothered to learn who I was. And as that realization started to sink in, the morning air felt different. The calm returned, not because the situation was over, but because it was finally heading in the right direction. The ranch wasn't going anywhere. And neither was I. As the sun climbed higher, the situation grew more complicated, not louder. That was the part most people didn't expect. The HOA president had imagined chaos, confrontation, maybe even handcuffs. Instead, she got paperwork, questions, and silence. The kind of silence that slowly exposes lies. The officers began verifying details the way they were trained to do. Property lines. Jurisdiction. Ownership records. The call that brought them here was treated seriously at first, but seriousness doesn't last long when facts don't cooperate. The ranch wasn't hidden. It wasn't disputed land. Everything about it pointed to long-term, lawful ownership. Meanwhile, the HOA president hovered nearby, growing more restless by the minute. Confidence has a shelf life when it's built on assumptions. She had arrived expecting a performance, not an investigation. Every passing moment without my removal chipped away at the fantasy she had created. What she didn't realize was that her call had already triggered a chain reaction she couldn't control. Once law enforcement starts verifying information, the truth has a way of surfacing quickly. Her claims about association boundaries fell apart almost immediately. The HOA's authority stopped miles away from my fence. The land records made that painfully clear. But instead of backing down, she doubled down. She escalated her story, shifting blame and reframing the situation to protect herself. Suddenly, it wasn't about ownership anymore. It was about safety concerns. About suspicious behavior. About vague accusations that couldn't be proven but sounded serious enough to justify her actions. That tactic might have worked on someone unfamiliar with how these situations usually play out. It might have intimidated a regular homeowner or someone without experience dealing with false complaints. But it didn't work here. The officers noticed the inconsistencies. The timeline didn't make sense. Her urgency didn't match the facts on the ground. The ranch showed no signs of trespassing, no signs of recent takeover, no signs of conflict except the one she had manufactured herself. While all this was happening, I stayed calm. That calm wasn't accidental. It came from knowing exactly where I stood legally and understanding how quickly authority changes when truth enters the conversation. Panic feeds false narratives. Patience dismantles them. The longer the investigation went on, the more uncomfortable she became. Her body language shifted. The assertiveness softened. The certainty in her voice wavered. She had expected compliance, not scrutiny. Then came the moment where things started to turn sharply. One of the officers recognized my name. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden announcement or raised voice. Just a pause. A second look. A quiet verification over the radio. But that small moment carried weight. The tone shifted instantly. Professional curiosity replaced routine procedure. That was the point where her plan began to unravel completely. She had built her entire strategy on the assumption that she held the highest authority in the situation. That everyone else, including the police, would automatically side with her version of events. What she didn't account for was the reality that authority doesn't stack the way she thought it did. As information was confirmed, the dynamic changed. The officers weren't just dealing with a false complaint anymore. They were dealing with misuse of emergency services. With an attempt to leverage law enforcement for personal gain. With a civilian who had overstepped in a way that carried consequences. The HOA president sensed it before it was fully explained to her. People like her always do. The confidence drained from her posture, replaced by defensiveness. She began interrupting, justifying, reframing, anything to regain control of the narrative. But it was too late. Her son, the original reason for all of this, suddenly disappeared from the conversation entirely. His supposed need for the land was no longer relevant. All that mattered now was whether the call itself had been legitimate. And it wasn't. What made the situation almost surreal was how quickly her authority evaporated once it was challenged. The badge she thought she wore meant nothing outside her gated community. Her position didn't impress anyone anymore. Titles don't protect you when facts contradict you. By the time the officers stepped aside to discuss next steps, the outcome was already clear. The ranch was mine. The call was false. And the person who had expected to watch me be escorted off my own land was now facing questions she hadn't prepared for. Still, the final twist hadn't landed yet. Because the one thing she still didn't fully understand was who she had tried to bully that morning. She knew something was wrong. She could feel it. But she didn't yet grasp the full scope of her mistake. That realization was coming. And when it did, it would hit harder than any argument ever could. By the time the truth fully surfaced, the morning had transformed from chaos into clarity. The officers no longer stood in uncertainty. They stood in understanding. The ranch, the land, the boundaries, the records, everything pointed in one direction. This place was mine, legally and undeniably. What changed everything wasn't volume or confrontation. It was verification. Once my role was confirmed, the atmosphere shifted in a way that was impossible to miss. Professional courtesy replaced cautious distance. Procedures tightened. Conversations became quieter, more deliberate. The situation was no longer about removing someone from property. It was about correcting a serious misuse of authority. That was the moment the HOA president finally realized she had miscalculated beyond repair. Her confidence didn't collapse all at once. It unraveled slowly, piece by piece. The certainty in her posture faded. The control she thought she had dissolved under the weight of reality. For the first time since she had arrived, she wasn't directing the situation. She was reacting to it. The badge mattered, but not in the way people often imagine. It didn't grant me special treatment or immunity. What it did was strip away the assumptions she had relied on. She had believed law enforcement would act as her personal enforcement arm. Instead, they acted as they were meant to, based on facts, not entitlement. The irony was impossible to ignore. She had called 911 to intimidate me, to force compliance through fear. Instead, she had summoned the very system that would hold her accountable. The emergency line she abused became the record that documented her actions. Her insistence on authority exposed how little she truly had. As the officers explained the situation to her, her demeanor shifted from defensive to desperate. She attempted to reframe her actions as a misunderstanding, as concern, as confusion about property lines. But intent matters. And so does repetition. This wasn't her first complaint. It was simply her most reckless one. The consequences were laid out clearly. False reporting. Misuse of emergency services. Attempted coercion. None of it looked good when written down. The power she thought she wielded inside her HOA meant nothing in the face of real legal responsibility. The ranch remained quiet throughout it all. The land didn't care about titles or tantrums. It had been there long before her and would remain long after this incident faded into a cautionary tale. Standing there, watching the situation resolve itself, I was reminded why people like her struggle so much with places like this. You can't control what doesn't need you. Eventually, she was escorted away from the center of attention she had demanded. Not triumphantly. Not dramatically. Just quietly, with the kind of embarrassment that lingers far longer than anger ever does. Her son never got the land. He never even came close. The ranch stayed exactly where it belonged, untouched and unchanged. The HOA's influence ended where it always should have, at its own gates. When the officers finally left, the silence returned. Real silence. The kind that feels earned. The dust settled. The sun climbed higher. The morning continued as if nothing had happened, because for the land itself, nothing had. But the story didn't end there. Word spread quickly, as it always does in communities like this. Not the exaggerated version she would tell, but the truth. The one backed by records, reports, and consequences. Her authority within the HOA didn't survive the fallout. People began asking questions. Boards don't like attention. Especially the kind that exposes liability. In the end, she lost far more than she ever stood to gain. Reputation. Credibility. Control. All because she believed entitlement could replace legality. And as for me, I went back to my routine. Coffee on the porch. Boots on the dirt. The ranch at dawn, just as it should be. The difference was that this time, the quiet felt heavier with meaning. Some lessons are learned the hard way. And some calls should never be made in the first place.